I wake up every morning in a silence so thick it feels like dust in the air, clinging to me even before I get out of bed. My house is not large, just a single-story place built in the 70s, the kind of home couples bought when they were young and hopeful, when every corner promised a future that stretched endlessly ahead. Back then I painted the siding myself, planted a row of small maple trees in the front yard, and promised my wife we would grow old here together, surrounded by neighbors, children, grandchildren, and eventually the peace of routine. For many years that promise felt real. Every morning I would hear my wife moving in the kitchen before I even opened my eyes. The soft rattle of pans, the gurgle of the coffee maker, the faint hum of her humming some hymn she had loved since childhood. It all made life feel warm and secure. Now there is nothing but the uneven ticking of the clock on the wall, a gift we received at our wedding nearly half a century ago, and the creak of the floorboards under my own tired steps. I am 76 years old, and though the number shocks me when I say it out loud, my body reminds me of it constantly. The knees ache with every movement, the eyesight has blurred around the edges, and my breath shortens if I walk more than a few blocks. Yet in my mind I still feel younger, still remember what it was like to be strong, to drive my wife to the lake for Sunday picnics, to carry heavy boxes without a second thought, to dance with her in the living room when we thought no one was looking. Now strength is a memory, and dependence is the reality. When my wife died 2 years ago, the rhythm of my days collapsed into an endless repetition of small rituals that I cling to, because they are all I have left. I make my own coffee, though it never tastes like hers, no matter how carefully I measure the grounds, and I sit at the kitchen table with the newspaper I can barely read without glasses, pretending for a moment that she might appear in the doorway, smiling alive. Her grave is only 15 miles away on the far side of town in a cemetery lined with old oaks that shade the stones like guardians. I used to drive there every week without fail, cleaning the headstone, laying fresh flowers, sometimes just sitting on the bench near her name carved in granite and talking out loud as if she were still sitting beside me. But last year I surrendered my driver's license after failing the vision test, and the freedom I had taken for granted vanished with a single sheet of paper stamped by the Department of Motor Vehicles. Now I depend on others for rides, a dependence that feels humiliating in ways I never expected. Asking for help from strangers is one thing, but asking my own daughter has become the most painful of all. My daughter, Claire, lives only 10 minutes away with her husband, Raymond. They are comfortable, middle class, always rushing from one obligation to another, and though their house is twice the size of mine, it feels colder every time I visit. Claire was once a bright, affectionate child, always running into my arms when I came home from work, always eager to help her mother in the kitchen or sit at the piano and play the songs we both loved. Somewhere along the way, in the years of college, career, and marriage, that warmth hardened into something practical, almost calculating. She speaks to me now in clipped sentences as if I were a client rather than a father, measuring every word for efficiency. Raymond is polite enough when he wants something, but most of the time his glances are filled with thinly veiled impatience, as though my very presence is an inconvenience they endure out of duty. I am not naive. I know I am no longer the man I once was. I am slower, more forgetful, sometimes repeating myself in conversation, sometimes misplacing things. But I am not useless, and I am certainly not incapable of love, loyalty, or grief. I feel them all with a sharpness that cuts deeper than ever in these years of solitude. My greatest need, the one request that keeps me tethered to life, is to visit my wife's grave. That simple act is what allows me to carry on, to imagine she is not entirely gone, but waiting for me somewhere beyond those carved letters. And yet, that request, so small, so sacred, has become the very thing my daughter refuses me. The first time I asked her after giving up my license, she said she was too busy, that she had errands to run, that maybe next week would be better. I accepted it then, telling myself she would remember, that she cared more than her tone suggested. But weeks passed, and every time I asked, she brushed it aside with another excuse. Once she said the cemetery was depressing for the grandchildren, another time that she and Raymond had a dinner party to prepare for, another that gas was too expensive to be wasted on unnecessary trips. Each time her words landed on me like stones. small and heavy, piling up until I felt buried beneath them. I have tried alternatives, though they are humiliating in their own right. I once called a taxi company only to be told the round trip would cost more than I could comfortably spend on my pension. I considered public buses, but the nearest stop is 3/4 of a mile from my house, a distance my knees refuse to endure, especially carrying flowers. Once, in a moment of stubbornness, I attempted the walk myself, tripping after only half a mile and sitting on the curb until a stranger offered to drive me home. That day I felt not just old, but defeated, a man whose devotion to his wife had been reduced to a failed errand. What hurts more than the physical struggle is the indifference of my own blood. Claire knows how much it means to me, yet she acts as if my grief is a burden she should not have to carry. She tells me I am living in the past, that it is unhealthy to dwell on the dead, that I should focus on the present and on the family who is still here. But when she says family, she means herself and Raymond, not me. She wants me to forget the woman I loved for 50 years, the one who raised her, sacrificed for her, and held the family together with quiet grace. To forget her would be to forget myself, and I cannot do that, not even to please the daughter who shares my blood, but not my heart. In the evenings, I sit in the living room surrounded by the remnants of the life my wife and I built together. Her photographs still hang on the walls, the one of our wedding day where her smile could light up a room, the picture of her holding Claire as a newborn, the candid shot of her laughing at a summer picnic while her hair blew wildly in the wind. I keep her chair by the fireplace exactly as it was, a small indentation in the cushion where she used to sit with her knitting. Sometimes I catch myself turning toward it, ready to speak before the reality strikes again. The silence that follows is unbearable, but I force myself to sit with it, to let the grief wash over me like a tide that never retreats fully. When neighbors see me on the porch, they wave politely, sometimes asking how I am doing. I smile, say I am fine, because that is easier than explaining the truth that I am a man suspended between two worlds, still alive but half buried in memory, clinging to rituals that mean nothing to anyone else. They see an old man sipping tea on his porch. They do not see the nights I wake in tears, reaching across an empty bed for the woman who once made me whole. This is the life I live now, a narrow corridor of routine, grief, and small humiliations. My body betrays me, my family ignores me, and the only solace I know is in the cold stone that bears my wife's name. To reach that stone should not be too much to ask, and yet in my daughter's eyes it is an imposition, an inconvenience, something to be denied. I feel with every refusal that I am being erased piece by piece, just as surely as she tries to erase the memory of her mother. And though I do not yet know it, this quiet erasure will soon drive me to actions I never imagined myself capable of. Actions that will change, not only my life, but theirs, forever. It happened in early October, the air already brittle with that thin cold that finds the joints before it finds the cheeks. And with each day the trees along our street were giving up more of themselves to the ground. So when I woke on the first anniversary of my wife's death and saw the maple by the porch shedding red leaves like quiet embers, I felt, with a clarity that startled me, that I had to stand at her headstone before the sun set, had to say her name out loud in the place where it meant the most, had to touch the cool granite and leave the flowers she always loved, which were white lilies for their clean scent and the way they opened slowly over days, as if reluctant to give up all their beauty at once. I showered and dressed with the deliberateness of a man preparing to testify, polished the old shoes whose leather had thinned where my toes bent, and I wrote a small note to tuck beneath the ribbon, a few lines that would have embarrassed me in younger years because men in my family did not speak this way. But grief rearranges the furniture in your soul, and what once felt melodramatic becomes merely necessary. I called Claire at 8 because I wanted to give her time to rearrange whatever plans she had, and I softened my voice as if gentleness might make the request smaller, telling her that it was the day and that I would be grateful if she or Raymond could take me up to the cemetery after lunch, that I would pay for gas and coffee and anything else, that all I needed was an hour, maybe less, and that I had already bought the flowers and written the note and would be waiting on the porch. She was already in her car, and the sound of the turn signal clicked through the line like a metronome, and she told me the day had gotten complicated, that there was a budget meeting, that she had promised to meet a client, that the boys had soccer, and that everything was colliding. And then she said something about how lingering over graves never helped anyone, how her therapist believed rituals were useful only when they moved people forward, not when they glued them to the past, and that perhaps I should try writing a letter and letting it go without making a scene. I reminded her that I had surrendered my license and could not get there on my own, that this was not a whim but an obligation of love, and she sighed, the kind of sigh that measures patience in quarters, and told me to text her later because she might be able to swing by after 5 if traffic cooperated, which it never does on the bypass. And then she said she would call me back, and the line went flat in my ear because calls for her end the way statements end, without farewell or soft landing, and I sat there with the phone in my hand like a schoolboy who had misread an assignment. At noon, I walked to the bus stop with the lilies wrapped in paper against the wind because pride can override pain for a few blocks, and because I wanted to believe I could still act like a man who finds solutions. And I studied the schedule posted in a sun-faded case, only to learn that the line nearest the cemetery ran twice in the morning and once at night, and that I had missed the last midday run by 20 minutes. So I stood there, flowers against my chest, while cars hissed past and small. Flecks of leaf litter stuck to my coat, and I did the math of distance and slope and whether my knees could take such a walk even if I stopped at each light pole to breathe. A young man in a grocery store apron recognized the situation without needing the details and asked where I was headed. And when I answered, he offered to order me a rideshare from his phone. But as we watched the screen together, the fare climbed with each minute, and the map pulsed with demand, surcharges I could not justify. And I said, "No, thank you." And he hovered with the kind of thoughtful concern strangers allow themselves. Then he returned to his job after extracting from me a promise to sit on the bench and rest before trying anything foolish. I sent Claire a message that I was at the stop and that the bus schedule would not cooperate, that I could meet her anywhere if she preferred a different route, that I would keep the flowers fresh with water when I arrived, and I added a small heart at the end because I wanted to be the father who is not a problem to solve, but a person to be considered. She did not answer the text, but a few minutes later I received a short thread of blue bubbles that gathered like hailstones. "Please don't wander. It's not safe. We'll figure another day. Today is not good." And then a line that cut in a way she may not have intended, that the cemetery would still be there tomorrow, even if I refused to move on from habits that weren't helping. By 3, the cold was in my bones and the lilies had bruised where my gloves pressed. So I walked to a coffee shop and asked for hot water in a paper cup, and the barista said of course and wouldn't take my $1. And I sat near the window with the flowers propped in that improvised vase, watching the afternoon slip toward evening while my phone lay motionless on the table. And I remembered the last time my wife and I had been there together, splitting a cinnamon roll, her laughing at the sugar that dusted my lip like snow and swiping it with her thumb. And the memory became a kind of proof that love had actually happened to us, and not just to the people in the photographs on our shelves. At 4:30, Claire called, and her first words were that she was pulling into my driveway now and that I needed to come home because we would have a quick talk about plans. And the tone packed everything into the word quick: efficiency, impatience, condescension. When I reached the house, she was standing in the kitchen with her coat still on and the keys swinging from one finger. And Raymond leaned against the doorframe with that managerial posture he uses on subordinates, and they told me they would not be driving me today, that they had discussed it thoroughly, that I had made choices that worried them, that the bus stop episode was a red flag, and that they did not have the bandwidth to be on-call chauffeurs for me every time I felt fragile. I lifted the lilies to show that I had kept them safe, and Claire took the bundle as if to help. And in one practiced movement she stripped the damp paper and dropped it in the trash with the same flat efficiency I've watched her use on receipts, and I could not decide whether she understood what she had just done or whether ritual blindness had overtaken her to the point where even flowers were merely logistics. Raymond started talking about quality of life and how grief can become a lifestyle if you feed it about the need to set boundaries for everyone's sake, about gas prices and time, and then he pivoted to liability, which is his favorite word because it makes other words irrelevant. And he asked what would happen if I fell among the stones, who would be responsible, whether I expected them to leave meetings and soccer games each time I felt a wave of sadness that might be better handled by professionals in a group setting at church where trained facilitators could provide tools. And it was at that moment that I realized my marriage had been reduced in their minds to a clinical condition requiring management. Claire said she had found a grief group on Tuesdays and had put my name on the list, and she handed me a glossy brochure, and then she mentioned, almost as an aside, that if I insisted on unsafe attempts to reach the cemetery, they would have to consider an assisted living facility where transportation and oversight were part of the package, and the word package knocked something off a shelf inside me because it wrapped my life in cellophane and stapled a price to it. I asked her, quietly and carefully so the words would not wobble, whether she remembered what this day was, and she said of course she remembered and that she missed her mother too, but that her way of honoring memory wasn't to stand in the cold, staring at a stone, and she said that if her mother were here she would tell me to let go, and I replied that her mother was not here and that the stone was the place most near to here that she still was. And then we stood in that fault line that opens in kitchens when people share a roof of history but not a language for pain. I waited until they left because my pride still has a spine even when my back does not, and I went into the garage where my old sedan sat like a loyal dog with cloudy eyes. The plates expired and the battery long dead, and I put my palm on the hood to feel the accumulated cold, and I told the car out loud that I was sorry, which is to say I told my wife through that old machine that I had failed to reach her today, and then I sat on the tool bench and wrote another note because words were all I had left that could move without permission. The house settled around me with those small creaks that sound like elderly conversation, and I thought about the grandchildren who had not asked where their grandmother lay, and I wondered whether Claire had ever told them the location or whether she had smoothed even that detail out of their lives in service of a theory that pain is best avoided when it cannot be monetized. And I felt a warmth rise from my anger that surprised me, because anger, in old age, usually burns low. Yet there it was, a steady flame that illuminated a thought I had been refusing. If the road to the cemetery had been closed to me by the very people who should have opened it, then perhaps I had to build a road they could not block, a road made not of asphalt but of consequences. I did not draft a plan that night because plans belong to younger men and to Raymond with his spreadsheets, but I vowed something older and simpler, that I would not beg for what love already owed me, that I would not ask permission to remember, and that the next time Claire pronounced the word boundaries, I would show her how wide mine could be. Before I went to bed, I unwrapped the lilies and trimmed the stems again and placed them in a tall jar by the window where the moon could find them, and I whispered my wife's name, the way you whisper a prayer when you are no longer sure anyone is listening, and I told her that today they refused me, but that refusal had done something to me I had not expected. It had straightened my back and cleared my sight and taught me that grief, when dishonored, grows teeth, and that the man they believed was made of apologies and requests still carried inside him the spine of the husband who once promised not to let her stand alone in any weather. I slept poorly, but not with the helplessness of the previous months. I slept like a soldier waiting for a dawn he has chosen. The days after that failed anniversary visit stretched out like an endless corridor of disappointments, each one lined with the same harsh refusal, the same cold dismissal that left me smaller than before. What began as a polite excuse on Claire's part soon hardened into a pattern, and then into a rule that she no longer even attempted to soften. Each time I gathered my strength to ask her again if she might take me to the cemetery, her voice grew sharper, her tone more brittle, as though I were demanding something outrageous instead of begging for the simplest act of decency a daughter could extend to her father. Once she told me flatly that my weekly morning trips were obsessive, that I was addicted to sadness in a way that was not healthy for anyone, least of all her. Another time she snapped that I should stop dragging everyone into the grave with me and that I was turning grief into a performance. I remember standing in her kitchen, my hands trembling around a cup of coffee she had grudgingly poured, while Raymond smirked from across the room and muttered that if I wanted so badly to spend time with the dead, maybe I should just hurry up and join them. He laughed at his own cruelty, and though Claire gave him a look that was meant to be reproach, she did not contradict him. That evening, when I returned to my lonely house, I sat in the armchair staring at the worn carpet, repeating his words to myself until they etched into my skin like burns. Better off buried. That was how my son-in-law saw me, and in Claire's silence I heard a kind of agreement, the assent of someone who no longer recognized the man who had raised her as anything but a burden to be managed, or, at best, tolerated. The lilies I had bought for my wife had already wilted in their jar, the petals bruised and curling at the edges, and I could not bring myself to throw them away because they seemed to mirror my own decline too perfectly. I kept them until they collapsed into brown mush, and then I buried them in the garden with a kind of reverence, whispering that at least they would find the soil again while I remained suspended above ground, unwanted, out of place. The humiliations did not stop with refusals. There were the small daily reminders that my presence in their lives was not just unwanted, but inconvenient. When I tried to call Claire in the evenings, the calls went unanswered, and on the rare occasions when she picked up, her tone was rushed, clipped, and laced with impatience, as though she were speaking to a telemarketer. If I asked about the grandchildren, she would deflect, saying they were busy with sports, with studies, with friends. When I suggested that perhaps they might accompany us once to visit their grandmother's grave, she laughed in a way that startled me with its cruelty, saying there was no reason to burden children with that kind of darkness. A week later, I overheard the boys joking that they had no idea where their grandmother had even been buried, and when I confronted Claire about it, she brushed me off with a shrug, saying there was no need to force them into outdated rituals. My wife's entire existence, the memory of her resting place, had been erased from the family narrative as though she had never lived, never cooked, never prayed, never sung them to sleep. That realization landed heavier than any insult. She was gone not only from life but from the story we had built, scrubbed away by the very daughter who owed her everything. One Sunday, when the air carried the first bite of approaching winter, I asked Claire once more. I had dressed carefully that morning, wearing the suit I had buried my wife in, polished the old shoes, combed my thinning hair as though presentation might matter, as though appearing dignified might soften her heart. She looked at me as though I were mad, then laughed and told me to change into something less theatrical, because the neighbors might see. When I insisted, she slammed the car keys down on the counter and declared she would not drive me anywhere, not then, not ever again. Raymond, leaning lazily in the doorway, added, "Good, because I'm tired of chauffeuring a ghost." His eyes met mine in a way that dared me to object, dared me to push back as though he wanted a fight. But my words died in my throat, choked by years of swallowed indignities, and I walked out into the yard instead, staring at the rows of leaves piling against the fence, each one crisp, dead, discarded, as though nature itself had decided to mirror my life. The silence between us grew thick after that. Claire stopped calling entirely, and when I reached out, the calls went to voicemail. Weeks passed with no visit, no message, no sign that I still existed in their world. My only company was the sound of the clock and the ache in my chest. Sometimes I sat in the garage staring at my old car, now a husk with a dead battery, thinking how easily I could have driven myself if not for the loss of my license. That symbol of independence taken from me by the state now chained me to their whims, and I began to feel like a prisoner in my own home. I even called a taxi company again, but the operator reminded me of the price, and I hung up before giving the address, ashamed that I could not even justify the expense to myself. One afternoon, needing air, I walked to the corner store for milk and bread, moving slowly with my cane. At the counter, the young clerk, seeing my exhaustion, offered to help carry the bag back to my house. He chatted kindly as we walked, and at one point he asked whether my family came by often to visit. I froze, embarrassed, and muttered something about them being busy, about grandchildren and sports, about schedules. but he looked at me with the kind of polite pity young people reserve for the very old, and I knew he had already guessed the truth. I felt smaller than ever, a man exposed as unloved in the most ordinary of settings, betrayed not by violence but by neglect. That night, as I prepared a simple dinner of soup and toast, I heard laughter from the street. I looked out the window and saw Claire and Raymond stepping out of their car with grocery bags, returning from a day of shopping. They lived close enough that I could watch their driveway from mine, close enough that I could see the ease with which they moved together, the casual smiles, the life intact and unburdened. Yet they had not so much as knocked on my door in weeks. I stood in the darkness of my kitchen, soup cooling on the table, and realized that I had been relegated to the margins of their lives like an afterthought, a line item too small to include. The cruelty sharpened when they spoke of me to others. Once at church, I overheard Raymond joking to another man about how the old man spends his days crying at stones and how he and Claire were doing their best to keep him from embarrassing himself in public. They laughed together, as if my devotion to my wife's memory were nothing but a weakness to be mocked. When I confronted Claire afterwards, she dismissed it with a wave of her hand, telling me not to be so sensitive, that it had only been a joke. But her eyes betrayed a flicker of annoyance, as though even my hurt feelings were another inconvenience added to her plate. Each slight might have been survivable on its own, but together they built into something heavier, something I could not shake off. It was not just neglect, it was erasure, a systematic sanding down of who I was and who my wife had been, until nothing remained but the outline of a man to be dismissed. And as the weeks turned into months, I began to realize that their refusals were not temporary, not momentary lapses of kindness, but a deliberate boundary they intended to enforce forever. I would not be driven to the cemetery again. I would not be granted that sacred act of mourning. My wife's resting place had been turned into forbidden ground, and by extension, so had the memory of our life together. In those moments of clarity, a new feeling began to stir beneath the grief. It was not the resigned sadness of a widower, but something darker, steadier, more dangerous, anger. Anger at Claire for choosing convenience over love, at Raymond for spitting his disdain so openly, at myself for having raised a daughter who could discard her own mother's memory so easily. That anger began to grow roots, and though I did not yet know what it would become, I felt for the first time in many months that my story was not over. Something inside me had shifted. They had taken from me the dignity of mourning, but in doing so, they had awakened something I thought had long since died, the will to act, not with pleas or requests, but with consequences. The breaking point arrived not in a thunderclap of drama, but in the quiet discovery of something so cruelly mundane that it hollowed me out more completely than all the previous refusals combined. One Saturday afternoon I found myself sitting at Claire's dining table while the grandchildren sprawled on the floor with their electronic devices, their faces lit by the cold glow of screens, when one of them, Jacob, the younger, asked where exactly. His grandmother had been buried because a classmate at school had spoken about visiting his grandfather's grave over the weekend, and Jacob, in that unfiltered way children possess, wondered aloud why he had never seen his own grandmother's. His older brother snorted and shrugged, and then, to my horror, said he thought maybe she had been cremated and the ashes scattered somewhere because that was easier, and then both of them laughed lightly and returned to their games as though the question had never mattered. I sat frozen, staring at them, my heart hammering so hard I could barely swallow, because in that instant it became clear that my daughter had never taken the trouble to tell her children the truth, had deliberately concealed the place where their grandmother lay, had chosen to erase that sacred ground from their inheritance. My wife's resting place, the place I had fought to reach, had been reduced to a blank in the minds of the very descendants she had loved with a patience that had no end. I turned to Claire then, unable to hold back, and asked how it could be that her own sons did not know where their grandmother was buried. She looked at me without shame, her eyes flat, and said she had made the decision years earlier not to tell them, because children did not need to carry the weight of death, because she wanted them to grow up free from what she called morbid attachments, because she believed the healthiest future was one that looked only forward. I felt the words like blows, each syllable an erasure, not only of my wife, but of the values we had lived by together, values that taught remembrance as an act of love, not weakness. I told her, my voice shaking but clear, that she had no right to deprive them of their grandmother's memory, no right to choose ignorance for them. She countered that it was her responsibility as a mother to decide what was best, and that if I insisted on contradicting her, then perhaps it would be better if I saw less of the children altogether. The room went quiet then except for the faint digital sounds of the boys' games, and in that suffocating silence I realized that my daughter had not only closed the road to the cemetery for me, but had built a wall around her children as well, sealing them off from the woman who had once rocked them in her arms. That night, back in my empty house, I opened the drawer where I kept old letters and documents, and I took out a photograph of my wife holding the newborn Jacob in her arms, her face radiant with love, her eyes filled with the quiet pride of a grandmother who had waited her whole life for that moment. I looked at it for a long time, my chest aching, and I swore to her image that I would not allow this erasure to stand. It was not enough to grieve silently anymore. It was not enough to plead with a daughter who had already decided that her mother's memory was inconvenient. Something had shifted in me that day, something hard and unyielding, a clarity that I had been resisting for months but could resist no longer. I could no longer be merely the old man asking for a ride. I had to become the man who defended his wife's place in the world, even if that defense cost me the last threads of peace with my daughter. It was then that I began to look at my circumstances differently. Instead of seeing only the cage of dependence, I started to see the levers still left in my hands, the quiet powers I had almost forgotten. I remembered that part of their house had been purchased with money I had given years ago, when Raymond's business had nearly collapsed, and Claire had wept on the phone, begging for help. I had written the check then with no hesitation, because that is what a father does when his child is in need, and I had allowed the documents to be drawn up in a way that kept my name attached to a share, believing it a mere formality. That formality now glowed in my memory like a hidden weapon, a proof that I was not as powerless as they believed. I also remembered the joint account I had set up decades ago, into which I had funneled a steady stream of savings, with the promise that it would support Claire in times of need, a stream she had grown accustomed to as though it were her birthright. I had stopped paying attention to it in recent years, trusting her to manage it, but when I requested the statements, I discovered she and Raymond had been using it as if it were their own personal treasury. The betrayal pressed down on me, but it also opened my eyes. They depended on me far more than they wanted me to realize. The cemetery had been denied me, but knowledge had been returned, and knowledge is often the beginning of power. I began to imagine what it would mean to withdraw my hand from their comforts, to let them feel the absence of my contributions, to force them to recognize that the man they mocked and dismissed was the very man who had kept them afloat more times than they could count. And as that thought settled into me, as it grew roots alongside the anger that had already been planted, I felt something I had not felt in years, a rising strength, a conviction that I was not finished, that I still had the capacity to shape the future. The quiet widower, ignored and humiliated, could still become the architect of a reckoning. I went to bed that night with a strange calm, the photograph of my wife resting on the table beside me, and I whispered to her that, though they had tried to erase her, I would carve her memory into the very walls of their lives, that they would not be allowed to forget that if they would not carry her in love, then they would carry her in consequence. For the first time in many months I slept without dreams, because I no longer needed them. I had seen, with painful clarity, that the road ahead was not about begging, but about building, and that the man they believed to be helpless was about to show them just how much he could still take away. I woke the next morning with a steadiness I had not felt since before the hospital corridor swallowed my wife, and gave her back to me as a silence, and I began, slowly and methodically, to gather every thread of my life that I had handed to Claire, and Raymond as if to trusted stewards, because it had dawned on me that stewardship was not what they had chosen. They had chosen control dressed as concern and expedience dressed as love, and it was time to unchoose them. The first errand was to the county recorder's office, that unfashionable corner of government where lives are reduced to parcels, signatures, stamps, and the kind of ink that outlives sentiment, and there, under the fluorescent lights that make no allowance for nostalgia, I asked for copies of any recorded interest with my name, and the clerk, kind in the way of people who have watched families crumble across countertops like this one, produced a folder that told a story more plainly than any argument we had ever had around Claire's kitchen table. My name was indeed on their deed, not as a courtesy, but as an owner, the language clear enough that even an old man with cloudy eyes could see the truth of it, and I stood there reading the legal description as if it were a psalm, because it spoke of something sacred, not land, but dignity, and the right to say no after years of saying yes. I took that folder to an attorney whose name the pastor's wife pressed into my palm after a service where I had not been able to sing a note, a woman named Rivera who wore her hair pinned back and her words precisely, and when I told her what had been happening, she did not blink or opine about feelings. She opened a legal pad and began listing actions in a hand that made no room for hesitation. We would revoke any stale powers of attorney I had once signed in the fog of grief, when Claire brought papers to my doorstep under the banner of helping with paperwork. We would change beneficiary designations that inertia had left vulnerable. We would place a standstill notice with the title company to block any attempt at encumbrance without my consent. And we would notify the bank that no one, the one, not daughter, not son-in-law, not anyone, was to be added or treated as an authorized voice on my accounts. She warned me, almost gently, that when people who rely on your money discover you have found the latch on the gate, they do not sit down to reconsider their lives. They rattle the fence and then bring tools, and I said I understood, though I did not yet know what their tools would be. The tools arrived sooner than expected and in a form at once predictable and demeaning, because 2 days after I signed the revocations and watched Rivera's assistant notarize them with the calm efficiency of a nurse tapping a vein, there came a knock at my door that I recognized from old television shows and from the dread that ran ahead of it, the polite double rap of a wellness check. A man and a woman stood on my porch with badges and soft voices, and they explained that a call had come in from a concerned family member about an elderly man who was confused, who had been wandering, who was fixated on cemeteries, who had been seen standing for long periods in the cold without appropriate clothing, and who might be a danger to himself. I invited them in because I have nothing to hide except my sorrow, and I made tea as if they were the grandchildren I rarely saw, and we sat at the kitchen table while I answered their questions fully and clearly, producing my medications from the cabinet with labels intact, my calendar with appointments neatly written, the receipts from the grocery store on the counter, and the folder from the recorder's office that I laid open like a shield, because I knew, even as they spoke, whose voices they had carried to my threshold. They left at last with apologies and a form, and the woman squeezed my forearm in a way that said she understood more than policy allowed her to admit, and when the door closed I stood there with the form in my hand and told the empty room that I had just witnessed what it looks like when love misnames control for kindness. That afternoon a bank officer called a man I had known for years by the pleasant fiction of first names, and he told me with the embarrassed cough of professionals caught between rules and relationships that someone had attempted, in the morning, to add herself as an authorized contact on my primary accounts using a durable directive that cited my supposed short-term memory disorder, and that the bank had paused the request because my recent in-person visit and the revocation paperwork were already on file. He did not need to say Claire. The shame in his voice said it for him. I thanked him for the caution and authorized him, with a steadier voice than I would have expected from myself, to flag any future attempts as potential fraud. And when he asked if I wanted to change branches to avoid awkward encounters, I told him I was finished avoiding, and that if anyone needed a new doorway, it was not me. I hung up and sat with my hands flat on the table and listened to the clock measure a small victory, the kind that does not feel like triumph so much as the removal of a heavy boot from a sleeping chest. It was then, in the quiet after those small battles, that the larger truth began to surface, not from a confession, but from one of those unguarded oversights people commit when they believe the old are incapable of reading between lines. A letter addressed to me, but placed accidentally in Claire's bundle of mail. She had used my home address for one of their credit statements years back and never bothered to update it. Arrived with the morning post and sat there on my porch in the rubber-banded stack the carrier leaves when he is in a hurry. I opened it without thinking, the habit of a lifetime of paying bills on time stronger than my recent caution, and inside was a notice from a lender I did not recognize, referencing a home equity line of credit secured by the property with 3 names, mine among them, now in arrears and subject to acceleration if the past due amounts were not cured within 30 days. The amounts listed were not daunting in isolation, but the pattern was a string of missed payments, late fees, interest compounding, and a polite paragraph that translated to the naked truth. They had squeezed the house like an orange without the forethought to plant another tree. The motive lay there in black and white. This was never about protecting me from grief. It was about protecting their access to what they considered a reservoir into which they could lower a bucket without asking. I carried that letter to Rivera and watched the muscles gather at her jaw as she read. "We would," she said, "notify the lender that any future negotiation would require my presence and signature, and that there would be no further borrowing secured by an asset that included my name. If they needed money to cure their defaults, they would have to sell a car, cancel a vacation, or do the difficult work of telling their own truth to themselves." I asked what would happen if they did not comply, and she looked up at me with something that might have been respect and said that co-owners have remedies, some drastic, some plain, and that people who treat shared roofs like private tents sometimes learn the difference in court. I nodded, the room tilting a little under the weight of implications, and though the thought of legal war with my own daughter nauseated me, something older than nausea steadied me. The need to protect the memory of a woman who had never once put herself ahead of her child, the need to refuse a story in which her grave was sacrificed to a line of credit. The retaliation sharpened. Claire stopped speaking entirely and let Raymond carry the words, and he delivered them with the confidence of a man who has always won by speaking louder. He left me voicemails in which he described me as unstable, as manipulated by outsiders, as ungrateful for all they had done. And in one message he said very calmly that if I did not stop interfering in their financial affairs, they would petition the court for guardianship, present the wellness check as evidence, and bring in a neuropsychologist to testify about obsessive ideation and executive decline, phrases he had no doubt culled from an internet search he mistook for expertise. I took those messages to Rivera, who saved the recordings with an efficiency that matched her handwriting, and she explained that courts are not in the business of awarding control to adult children merely because a widower insists on visiting his wife's grave and managing his own money. That guardianship is an extreme remedy requiring proof, not irritation. Even so, she scheduled a comprehensive evaluation with a physician she trusted, not because we expected trouble, but because the best way to defang a lie is to be ready to lift your tongue and show the absence of fangs. In the midst of this, I made a decision that surprised even me, not in its sentiment, but in its method. If the road to the cemetery had been gated by my daughter, I would build another road with my own hands, not in law, but in tread. I hired through the church bulletin rather than the impersonal glow of an app a retired mechanic named Harlan who owned a reliable sedan and who, after Sunday service, told me he would be honored to take me out once a week, wait as long as I needed, and bring me home without hurry. The first time we drove, I felt the familiar nausea of those weeks of humiliation lift like fog, burned off by sunlight, and when we pulled beneath the canopy of oaks and I stepped onto the path with the flowers in my hands, the world righted itself. I told my wife everything, the letters, the visits, the attorney's pen scratching out the old permissions I had been foolish enough to sign, and I promised her that I would keep coming as long as my legs carried me, that I would not allow our story to be replaced by anybody's doctrine of efficiency. Harlan waited on a bench and watched the birds and said nothing when I returned, with eyes bright from tears, which is the exact amount of conversation a man needs after kneeling in the grass to tell the truth to stone. The second escalation of their campaign arrived with an invitation worded as a kindness that was nothing of the sort. Claire asked me to join them for Sunday dinner to talk things through, and because I am still a father who hopes the next meal might be the one where someone remembers how to love him properly, I went. She served a roast that smelled like the old house on holidays, and for a moment the years fell away. And then Raymond set a folder on the table beside the mashed potatoes and opened it to reveal a typed agreement in which I would assign to them the management of my daily living needs, which sounded benign until you read the parts where I would also provide them with access to my accounts for the purposes of efficiency, and I would consent to move into an assisted living complex they had already toured on my behalf, a place with cheerful flyers and a shuttle that, the brochure promised, made weekly trips to scenic locations. I asked whether the cemetery counted as scenic, and Claire sighed, the kind of sigh you shape when you think someone is being stubborn out of principle rather than out of love, and she said we had to be realistic, that this arrangement would prevent incidents, that I could not keep making unilateral decisions that affected the family. I told her, without raising my voice, that this family had been making unilateral decisions that affected me for years, and that the effect had been to cancel my wife's existence one car ride at a time. I did not sign the folder. I thanked her for dinner, washed my own plate because the habit of a lifetime is hard to break. I let myself out with a good night that felt at once too tender and too final. On the walk home I realized I was not as alone as I had feared, because across the hedge, Mrs. Bell, who has seen entire neighborhoods rise and sag, called my name softly and asked me to wait. And then when she reached the fence, she pressed my hand and told me not to doubt what I knew, that she had heard too much through thin summer air to be fooled by new winter manners, that love does not speak with the voice of a billing department, and she said if I ever needed a ride, she could call her nephew, who drives nights and owes her favors. I thanked her and felt my heart loosen a notch, because the world still contains people who see without paperwork and decide without signatures. The next week brought the results of the evaluation Rivera had arranged, a thick report that took me back to the days when performance reviews arrived in manila envelopes. Except this one examined the machinery of my mind rather than my bookkeeping. I read it in the attorney's office with relief so intense it felt like pain. Scores within age. Expectations, no evidence of dementia, insight intact, judgment preserved, grief appropriate to circumstances, and a line that made me sit up straighter, that my insistence on visiting my wife's grave represented a culturally normative mourning practice that should be supported rather than pathologized. Rivera smiled for the first time since we met and said this would make any petition for control not just difficult but embarrassing, and she asked whether I still wanted to proceed with the other actions we had discussed. And I said yes, because documentation heals nothing if behavior remains. We moved to freeze the joint account, to redirect all statements to a post office box only I could access, to place a fraud alert with the credit bureaus, and to retain a real estate broker not to sell immediately, which is a climax for another day, but to prepare the ground, because sometimes the knowledge that a door can be opened changes the conversation in a house where someone has been leaning on it from the other side. It was at the end of that long month, when the fights had become quiet and the silences louder, that Claire sent a final message, a text composed in the careful legalese she had learned by osmosis from Raymond, saying that if I continued to weaponize my ownership interests and withhold support, I would leave them no choice but to restructure the family relationship in a way that protected their household from emotional volatility, which is a lot of syllables to say we will stop pretending to be your children if you stop pretending to be our wallet. I sat on the edge of my bed and read it again, and then I set the phone down and looked at the framed photograph on the dresser where my wife's smile still makes a promise to me that I am trying, belatedly, to keep. I whispered to her that the storm was gathering and that I did not know yet whether it would break over my head or theirs, only that I could no longer lie down and call the thunder kindness. And although my knees ached and my breath shortened on the stairs, I felt stronger than I had any right to feel, because I had remembered something the young forget and the middle-aged despise, that a man who has already lost the love of his life cannot be frightened by the loss of people who abandoned him while he was still breathing. The confrontation I had long avoided came to me not in the privacy of their home, nor in the polite confines of an attorney's office, but in the raw light of a public place where strangers' eyes served as witnesses to the unraveling of what little pretense of family we still carried. By then the threads of silence, manipulation, and small humiliations had coiled into a rope pulled so tight around my chest that I could hardly breathe. And I knew that if I did not speak then, if I did not stand upright in my own truth, I would disappear into the role they had written for me, the senile old man, the burden, the fading shadow of a father whose rights and dignity could be crossed out with a pen. They came to me furious, faces taut with betrayal of their own making, accusing me of things I had done openly and lawfully, as though justice itself were an act of treachery. Claire's voice trembled not with sorrow, but with rage as she hurled at me the accusation that I had destroyed the family, that by cutting the money flow, by refusing their terms, by asserting rights they never believed I would claim, I had condemned them. Raymond, always smirking from behind his wife, chose that moment to bear his contempt more nakedly than ever, calling me a parasite who lived too long, who clung to memories instead of progress, who had chosen graves over grandchildren. The words stung, but not in the way they expected. They stung because I realized they no longer even cared enough to conceal their hatred, that every mask of politeness had been discarded, and in its place stood two people who wanted me erased, not because of my weakness, but because of my inconvenient strength. The cafe grew still around us, forks pausing midway, eyes glancing quickly away, but I did not falter. I let them pour their bile. I let Claire shriek about betrayal. I let Raymond sneer about incompetence, until their voices cracked under their own force. And then I spoke, not loudly, not theatrically, but with the calm of a man who has already buried the love of his life and therefore cannot be cowed by the loss of anything else. I told them that they had abandoned me long before I ever withdrew my hand from their comfort, that they had treated me not as father or companion, but as an obstacle between themselves and my bank account. I reminded them of the cemetery they barred me from, of the grave they had kept hidden from their children, of the lies they spun about my memory lapses, my supposed frailty, the fictions they invented at dinner tables to strangers. My words did not tremble, though my hands clenched on the edge of the table, and for once they were silent, because truth, when spoken without fear, strips even the cruelest accuser of their momentum. Claire tried in one desperate pivot to soften her tone, to plead that we were still family, that she had only ever wanted what was best for me, that surely I did not want to spend my last years alone. But the plea rang hollow, because I had already been alone in a crowded dining room where they mocked my appetite, alone in a rented cottage while they drank wine at vineyards, alone in my own home waiting by the phone for calls that never came. I have been alone for years, I said quietly, and in that moment the weight shifted. It was no longer I who begged to be seen, it was they who scrambled to pull me back into their orbit, because the money, the house, the car, the accounts, every tether they thought bound me to them, had snapped. The final blow came not from me, but from Claire herself, who, in her desperation, spat out a lie meant to wound, claiming that her mother, my beloved wife, had often confided her regret, that she had felt neglected, unloved, unseen. For an instant the floor seemed to vanish beneath me, because the cruelty of that fabrication struck deeper than any insult to my mind or worth. To tarnish her mother's memory, to defile the love that had been the axis of my life, was the lowest act I had ever witnessed for my own child. But even as the ache rose in my throat, I recognized the tactic. It was not truth. It was desperation. It was the grasping hand of someone who knew she had already lost. And so I looked at her, not with anger, but with pity, and I told her softly that I would not let her weaponize her mother's memory, that our marriage had been imperfect but filled with love, and that nothing she said, no venom she spat, could erase the life we had shared. Raymond tried to reassert control, demanding terms, sneering that I could not cut them out forever, that the law and blood would always bind us. But I rose from the table then, steady despite the tremor in my knees, and I left them with the only truth that mattered, that family is not a contract written in inheritance or obligation. It is a covenant of love, and when that love is broken, deliberately what remains is nothing but strangers bound by resentment. I told them that I was free of their grip, that I owed them nothing, and that if they wished to curse my name in the years ahead, they would do so from houses bought without my hand, from lives financed without my sacrifice, because I was finished, carrying them on the back of my grief. I walked out of the cafe into the bright afternoon, the air cool and sharp, and for the first time in years I felt taller, as though I had returned to my proper height after years of stooping beneath invisible weights. Behind me, voices still rang out, Claire's shrill with desperation, Raymond's hard with bitterness, but they no longer reached me. The passers-by who had watched our confrontation parted silently, some with pity, some with admiration, and I walked through them without shame. The climax of our war was not thunder nor fists. It was clarity. I had reclaimed my dignity, and they had revealed themselves to the world not as children deprived of kindness, but as adults deprived of conscience. When I reached the quiet of my home that evening, I sat by the window with the photograph of my wife in my hands, and I whispered to her that I had done it, that I had defended her memory, that I had stood upright not only for myself, but for the love we had built. And though the room was silent, I felt something like an answer in the calm of my chest, in the steady rhythm of my heart, as though she approved, as though she too had waited for me to stop bowing to cruelty and instead to rise in the strength of what we once shared. That night I slept without nightmares, and if I dreamed only of her hand in mine, leading me not into a grave, but into the strange, unexpected freedom of living once more on my own terms. In the weeks after the cafe, the noise around my name quieted as if someone had closed a window on a winter storm, and in that hush I began the slow work of building a life that belonged to me alone, not as a reaction to their cruelty, but as an answer to the question of who I still was when no one was watching. I met with Rivera one last time in her narrow office with a steady ticking clock, and signed the papers that arranged my estate the way love, not fear, would have it arranged, placing what I had into a living trust in my wife's name, directing the bulk toward a scholarship at the community college for nursing students who had cared for the old with tenderness, setting aside a fund for the cemetery's upkeep and a bench under the oaks with her maiden name on a small bronze plaque, and writing letters that would be given to the grandchildren on their 21st birthdays, along with a modest inheritance that would only transfer if they visited their grandmother's grave and read aloud the stories tucked in the envelopes, not as a test to punish them, but as a doorway left unlocked in case they ever wished to step through. Claire and Raymond received nothing but a brief notification from Rivera that was all law and no drama, and in the narrow white space between its lines I finally recognized the difference between punishment and boundary. I was not striking them, I was simply refusing to be struck again. Harlan began driving me twice a week, sometimes more when the weather was kind to old knees, and each trip felt less like a pilgrimage of pain and more like a return to the small republic my wife and I had ruled together with casseroles and patience, and the habit of forgiving before nightfall, so that by the time the first lilies opened in the bed the groundskeeper let me claim, I could kneel without that tearing in my chest and talk about ordinary things. The neighbor's unruly hedge, a robin that had chosen the low branch this season, the way the sun made her name shine like wet stone and then fade again as a cloud passed. And in those ordinary details I found the scale on which life still made sense. I rented a small bungalow on the hill above the cemetery with a porch just big enough for a chair and a pot of basil, and at dusk I would sit there with her wedding ring threaded on a leather cord against my skin and listen to the evening settle into the trees, and the quiet that once scared me began to feel like company, as if she had moved from rooms and appliances into the gentle choreography of air and light. Sometimes I saw Claire's car idle at the bottom of the street and then pull away. Sometimes I received messages composed as if from a committee where the word family appeared like a brand name rather than a promise, and each time I answered once, briefly and without venom, to say that I forgave what could be forgiven and would not reopen what had been sealed, that my door was not locked, but my boundary was real, and that if she wanted to meet the conditions love requires, she knew where her mother lay and where I could be found. Late in March, when the grass shifted from brittle to hopeful and the bench plaque had finally been set, a young man in a college windbreaker approached me as I was trimming the spent lily stalks and asked, with a hesitance that reminded me of his mother as a child, whether I was the one who knew stories about his grandmother because he had a letter that told him to ask. And when he handed it over, I saw my own handwriting and the date of his 21st birthday, and understood that time, which had been my adversary for so long, had chosen to stand with me for once. We sat on the bench together for an hour while he read the short things I had written about her kindness, with returnable pie plates, and the way she would hum while measuring flour. And when he finished, he did not look at me with pity, but with recognition, and he asked if he could come again on Thursdays after class. And I said that graves don't keep schedules, but grandfathers do. And the smile that broke his careful face was so like my wife's that I had to turn my head and count the oaks until my voice steadied. I did not ask about Claire, and he did not volunteer, and that silence felt right, because reconciliation is not a courtroom where each side presents exhibits. It is a weather that arrives when it is ready, and until it does, you tend the garden and keep a chair open. On the day I purchased a burial plot beside my wife's, the clerk asked whether I wanted to inscribe the date of birth now and leave the rest blank. And I said yes, because certainty is a mercy for those who will stand here when my voice is gone, and I walked back to the bench lighter than I had expected, not because I longed to occupy the ground, but because the arrangement itself felt like a completed sentence, a full stop in a paragraph that had meandered too long through clauses of grief and indignation. I do not pretend that I do not miss my daughter. I miss her the way a healed bone aches when rain approaches, a memory of pain that is not the pain itself. And on some evenings I speak her name the way I speak our granddaughters and grandsons, gently and without accusation, and I let the wind carry it down the hill toward town, trusting that if it lands anywhere useful, it will do so without my instruction. What I know is this: the road I begged them to drive me has been made by my own 2 hands and the hands of people who owed me nothing and gave me kindness anyway, and in learning to walk it, I have grown back into the man my wife knew, not young, not unbroken, but standing. When I leave the cemetery, I no longer look over my shoulder as if chased. I look ahead to the small porch and the basil and the kettle that will sing in its own time, and I allow myself the rare luxury of believing that justice can arrive without applause, and that forgiveness can be true even when distance remains, because the life I now inhabit is not a stage, but a garden, and gardens are built on a patience that feels like prayer. If Claire should one day climb the hill and sit without a folder of conditions and a mouthful of arguments, I will make us tea, and we will walk the lanes, and I will tell her where I buried the first lilies and how the robins choose their branches. And if she does not, if the years go by and I learn her news from the same wind that found me in the worst hours, then still the bench will weather and the plaque will green, and my wife's name will keep on catching sunlight between the leaves, and that will be enough. I was denied a ride to the cemetery, but I learned to steer the rest of my days, and in that quiet steering I found not victory but peace, the only inheritance worth defending and the only story worth leaving behind.